Hi, and welcome to my live stream where every Friday we discuss about design, we discuss about different tools and techniques to really help the workflow of turning your design into code, but also how to design from scratch, how to work well with a team, and how to really be at the forefront of what's going on in this industry. So as usual, if you enjoy these live streams, please give a thumbs up, and it's really going to help me decide if I want to do more of these live streams and do it regularly. So I really appreciate that, and also enable the bell button so that you get notified at every time that we have a new live stream. So if everything goes well, let me just get started. All right, today we're going to discuss about design system, but more specifically, how to use auto layout, how to use components, how to organize everything so that it's not so difficult. Because a lot of times when you try to organize your design, it becomes extremely difficult to catch up, to update everyone in the team. So you don't want to spend too much time documenting your design. You want to set your system in place so that if you want to add a new item, you can just delete and add that new item, and it fits nicely. One thing that I love about Figma is auto layout. This is something that is very unique to Figma, and the way they do it is extremely effortless, which means that when I organize some of these colors and I want to add a new row, I can just duplicate it. Or if I want to delete one, it just nicely fits together the same way you would do in CSS or in code. And that's what I love about it. I don't want to spend too much time organizing this. In fact, I spend maybe a couple hours organizing these based on the components that I have created over time. And this is what's going to happen a lot is when you design, at the very beginning, you don't want to create components everywhere. And the reason why you don't want to create components everywhere at the beginning is because you're going to change it a lot. You're going to modify the design a lot. You're going to change the text fonts, the colors, the different illustrations. And when you do that, you want to leave it up to your creativity to kind of not be too limited and constrained by a structure in place. Now, when it makes sense to start creating components is when you start duplicating elements. When you start having multiple elements that you want to use in multiple places, such as this one is duplicated 4 times. This row here is duplicated 3 times, and you don't want to create those things from scratch. And as a result, that is when you start creating components. And the same thing with some of these navigations, such as the status bar, the tab bar, the home indicator, the avatar, the titles. And for me, it really helps to have the illustrations to be part of the components. And when I have these illustrations, it allows me to quickly switch between them. So for example, here, I create my component and I create a new card. And if I want to change the illustration, as long as those components have the same sizes, I'm going to be able to switch quickly between them, just like this. And it's super easy to organize and to preview how your layout is going to look like when you start implementing that in code. The more sophisticated it becomes, the more you can anticipate all the different scenarios when it comes to coding in CSS or in SwiftUI or in Flutter. And a lot of these rules are there to be in place to synchronize with the way development is done. So let me give you an example, and this is exactly what we're going to be learning today. Look at this layout here. If I want to update this layout to the different sizes of the iPhone, for example, and I want to change the size, Look at what it's doing if you don't set that. Nothing. It just does this, okay? But if I set my auto layout properly, and this is exactly what I'm going to show you, we are going to be able to update it nicely like this. Look, even the text is nicely fitting the content. And that's exactly what you want to do in the future as you put the final touch of your design. If you work in a team environment, you want to set this in advance so that when someone else want to use, let's say, a library of avatars, a library of these text fields, you want to be able to do this. The same with some of these content. You want to be able to prepare this and show your developers how it's going to look like across different resolution, but also allow them to play with your files. And you're going to see here, look at the magic. When I resize this, it's exactly like in CSS. So imagine if you have a smaller screen or a bigger screen, it's going to look like this. Of course, we're not as sophisticated to the point that we can set, let's say, separating by two columns and then, you know, allow this to jump to the right side. But at the very least, we can set the field container, the hooks content kind of stuff. There's a song that is playing right now. I don't have any music playing. Background song. Okay. Let me just go back, and if there's an issue with any sounds, please let me know and keep commenting so that I know if something is wrong. But let me move forward with this, and I want to show you how to turn this layout into an adaptive layout like this one. Okay? So let me delete this first, and let me duplicate this. So I'm going to isolate this to help with the performance. All right. The first thing is, let me just ungroup this. So now we have multiple elements. This is a typical layout. Most designers are going to start with this. They're going to place their text, their subtitles, their text field, and you know, this is very typical. And of course, you have your component because this is done multiple times. And see, I have a component here. If you want to go to the master component, you're going to right-click on it, and you're going to go to main component, and you're going to be able to see where you can change that. You see these 4 diamonds is what allows you to see that this is the main component. And when you change the main component, it's going to change the instance. Now, when you go to the main component, you can click on this button here that allows you to go back to the place that you came from. So let me do that again. I'm going to select a secondary one. I'm going to go to the main component. I see the main component, and let's say I want to change, I don't know, I want to change the padding to 4 instead. See? And when I do that, I go back here, and you can see that everywhere that is using that component has changed as a result of me changing the main component. So let me just go back because go back here. So this is a really neat way to stay organized. So I'm going to put it back to 8 and click return, and boom, it changed back every single component. Now, another thing that I want to do, oftentimes like designers are going to have like these set across different places. Maybe they're going to have one component here, and maybe they're going to move things around very manually like this. What I like to do instead of that is I'm going to set all my elements, and if you don't have the auto layout option enabled, you're going to group them first. Command J. So this is going to group, and when you group, you're going to be able to see this option here that says auto layout. So you're going to click on the plus sign, and when you do that, it's going to set a consistent spacing across your multiple items. And this is the same as CSS Grid or stacks in SwiftUI. And so I'm going to set, let's say, 16 of spacing between the elements, and I'm going to put back my 2 elements that I just remove. And if I want to set a new field, I can just duplicate it, and I have my new field right here. So that's essentially what I want to do when I design. And this is going to save you a lot of time. This is going to set a structure. But on top of that, when it comes to coding, you're going to be able to respect a lot of these same mechanism in place. Now let's talk about auto layout. So this is the basic of auto layout. This is done super quickly. Group auto layout, set the spacing between items, the padding inside your container. So for example, if I set to 20, you can see that it adds a padding of 20, but as a result, it also creates a bigger size for my container as well. So let me put it back. And what I want to do is to make sure that I have a consistent padding left and right against my screen here. So what I need to do is to set this container here. I'm going to set it to fixed, and instead of Hugs content means that it's going to respect the size of my content. But in this case, I want to respect the size of my screen. And as a result, I'm going to set to fixed, and I'm going to set left and right. So you're going to see these dotted lines left and right. And when I do this, you're going to see that the content doesn't change, but the container does change. Okay, that's really important to understand. A lot of people, they set this and they don't realize what has changed. Well, this has changed. The container has changed, but not the content. When it comes to the content, this is where you're going to set something called fill container. And there you go. If you set it to fill container, it means that you want to set to the 100% width of the container, which is the same as in CSS, right? If you set a div in CSS, it's going to set to the maximum width of that container. So I'm going to do for the rest of these elements, and I'm going to set it to fill container. As you can see, when I do this, I'm going to do this for this as well. Now, boom. Look at that. This is beautiful. And that's exactly what's going to happen when you're going to implement in CSS. So the next thing I want to show you is how to solve this problem right here. So it's setting the container, but my content is not respecting it. And that's why you have to make sure that also every single child element is going to also fill the container. So right here, I have a simple setup in place. I have auto layout, and it's set to be horizontal, which means that each item is going to be set across horizontally. If I open it, it's just one icon, and it's a text. The icon itself is a group. Now, when you're using auto layout is going to automatically spread all your items across horizontally or vertically. If you don't set the group, then every single of these elements, so let me ungroup this, you're going to see that, whoops. Oh, it's a component, so that's why it's not letting me. So let me detach it first. To give you an example, I'm going to have to detach it first. And let me ungroup this. When I ungroup, you can see that suddenly these two elements becomes one item inside my auto layout. And if you want them to overlay on top of each other, this is when you're going to need to group them together. And I'm going to put it back. And when you group them together, then you can overlay them just like normally you would design without auto layout. So it's important to do that. And now what we're going to do is we want to make sure that this content here is respecting all available space. And by all available space is that if this size change, I want to make sure that this takes whatever available space against the container. So what I'm going to do is set this to fill container. And when I do that, you're going to see that the text is trying to wrap against the container. And that's exactly what I want to do. So I'm going to do exactly that for the rest of the text as well, like this. So when I do this, and I resize my entire screen, because it's kind of like a domino effect, right? So your whole screen affects this giant container, which in turn affects every single smaller containers, which in turn affects the child text inside each of those text fields. So as a result, you're going to see a domino effect like this, and that's just beautiful. And you can tell your developers, hey, this is how I want it to adapt across multiple screens, and they're going to be super happy. So another thing you want to do here is also to be, sometimes you're going to have alignment issues. So if you do have alignment issues, you can always set to, when you go to auto layout, there's this little option right here that says alignment and padding, and this is where you can set custom paddings, across, multiple places such as top, bottom, left, and right. Just like in CSS and SwiftUI, you can customize each of those, places and paddings. And in this case, I set it to 50 from the bottom, but these ones is 8, but this one I can set it to 50 from the bottom. So this is a fairly new feature. I think it's only been available for a few months in Figma. So Figma keeps maturing, as the time goes by. And here I want to set my icon to be to the top. So there you go. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. Now, if I want to change this size here, I can also use a really cool feature which allows me to switch between portrait and landscape mode, as you can see here. Okay, and this is really cool to use, because then you can see how your layout is going to look like when you're in landscape mode on iOS. And of course, you can resize it manually. You also want to set the constraints properly so that each of those items are magneted against each of the borders. So for example, the status bar is set to hug the top. So this is what we call constraints. And if I want this to be left and right, that's when I have a dynamic size container. But if I have an element such as, let me set this outside of that, and I want this to be centered, I want to keep this center, then I'm going to use constraints instead. So I'm going to set it to center. So when I do that, then the text will remain in the middle. If I set it to left, and also you need to set from the bottom, from the top. So from the top, regardless of how I resize it, it's going to keep being at the top. But if I set it from the bottom, such as what I do here for this home indicator, if I set it from the top, then it's going to keep being there. But if I set it from the bottom, then when I resize vertically, it follows from the bottom. And that's the usefulness of constraints. Now, I don't think they have a way to set a max width, and this is why coding is so important, is that you have all of these extra tools that you will never be able to do, or at least not yet, do it in code. So for example, size classes allows you to set a condition, or media queries in CSS allow you to set a condition that says, okay, if the size is more than this, then make sure that we have 2 columns instead of 1 column. And those are really important, because you want to make sure that this size here never exceed. So let me just option resize, so that I can keep it resized from the center. And usually you want to set a max width, because you don't want it to look like a giant iPad or something like that, where your content is just going bigger and bigger and bigger. You have to still respect the typography rules, which means that your text should not have more than a certain amount of characters, like 45 to 90 characters per line. And the same thing with these. You don't want to set this to be too large, and that's why you want to set a max width when it's gonna come to code. But as it is, this is already really good, because you want to deal with at least some of these screen sizes, such as the iPhone 8, you have the iPhone 10, the iPhone 10 Plus, And so, for example, the iPhone 10 is 375, and the iPhone 10 Plus is 414. So as you can see, it's adapting beautifully between these two sizes, and that's exactly what you want to be able to do. And the same for 320, right? So a lot of developers are going to ask you, well, how is it going to look like on a smaller iPhone? And that's exactly what it's going to do. And there you go. You didn't have to do much work. It's all adapting across these multiple sizes. And yes, so in terms of the resources, someone is asking, well, what happens if you want to take a look at the source files? We do offer our source files at the end of the stream. I'm going to put this on DesignCode, and we have a live stream section, and each live stream has their source file. So I'm going to be sharing the screens that I'm presenting along with the design system up to a point where it's finalized enough. But you're going to have quite enough to be able to see how I'm designing each of these elements, each of these components, how I'm naming and organizing the layers in place. So, we really appreciate the subscribers. They allow us to, to be able to do this full time and have a team and, create beautiful content for you. So this is what's happening now. There's another thing, there's another trick that you should know, and I find this to be so useful, and this happens a lot, is when you have a third element, right? So right now, I have two elements that is aligned to the left side, but what if I have a third element and I want to push it so that the third element is at the very right, but the first two elements is at the very left? So let me try that. Let me duplicate this and put this to the right. So imagine, let's say we only have, let's say, an icon. So let me find this first. I'm going to move it here. And let's say, I have some icon. Let me get SF symbol, and I have a little pen icon that shows me that this place is editable. And so what I want to be able to do is to push the content. And well, you don't necessarily always have like field container, but let's say if you don't, and you have a fixed size, you're gonna see that the icon here, it's always going to the left or the right. And if I select the container, okay, you're gonna see that it's aligning. If allow me to align me to the left, middle, or right. But one thing I can do, and this I think not a lot of designers know this, is that there's little hidden option here called packed, and there's another option called space between, and this is just beautiful. It allows you to push the spacing across the elements, so it's gonna push whatever available space in between the items, and that's really useful. For example, if you have one element to the left and one element to the right, like this, and you don't necessarily want this to fill the container. So this is not a text. This is not a text. I don't necessarily want this to fill the container, because if I fill the container, it's going to look like this. It looks weird. And, and that's when I want to use a space between so that we have equal sizes, and it's going to push each items to the far ends. And we have something equivalent in CSS, and that's just a beautiful option. And you should definitely play with space between. It's super useful. So that's what I wanted to show you. Let's see if we can find more cases. And yeah, nesting auto layout is beautiful. So, well, I mean, if you look at this is kind of like nesting auto layout. So this is auto layout, and inside it you can have more auto layout. Of course, auto layout, as a base is really good for buttons. So for example, I have my text here, and I want to make sure that the text is wrapping around my my button. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna set auto layout. First of all, let me just detach this. And if I don't necessarily want to use like a full width, I want to make sure that it wraps against the text. So auto layout is going to allow me to do that. Now, right now, I have a bit of an issue because I'm inside, you know, I have my little gradient thing. Let me just isolate that element first. Okay. So right now I have these two that I want to set auto layout. Let me just forget the blur for a moment. So I'm going to set this, and I'm going to set auto layout. When I do auto layout, I'm going to set the padding so that, let's say I want to set 16 on all sides, like this. By the way, if you don't know, you can also press tab to go to the next value. And so when I set auto layout for a button, and this is super common when you design, and let's say your text change, you can see that the button wraps beautifully against your text. Now, when it comes to the blur here, I'm gonna set to the same size, and this is where I'm gonna need to. I cannot put inside the auto layout because it's going to, you know, set across multiple items. So I'm gonna need to group these two together, and there you go. I have my button with the gradient blur. For those who have missed the last live stream, to be able to do this gradient blur, you're going to select you know, the same size of your button. Okay, so I have a rectangle with these values, and well, let me just start from scratch. So I have my button, and I have my auto layout with the text. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to remove the text. So it's the same size. Now, I don't want an outline, so I'm going to remove the stroke, and I'm going to set the angular gradient. Okay, angular gradient is the same as any gradient. The difference is we have multiple colors. So normally you're going to have a gradient with multiple colors. You know, if you know, I guess it's worth repeating that we have a bunch of places where you can find gradients, such as this one where you have multiple colors, and you're going to be able to get these beautiful colors inside your design. And all of these resources and links are shared in the description, so feel free to use that. Now I have my linear gradient, which most designers use. What most designers don't use is the radial gradient. So radial gradient is really cool, especially when you set it to a really big circle like this. Okay, when it's small, it looks weird. There's also the angular gradient, so it's going to create this cone effect. And there's the diamond gradient, which I have yet to use a lot. Okay, but the angular gradient is really interesting because it allows me to set a circular abundance of colors and tones. And that's exactly what I want for the glow of my button. So, you know, I have multiple angular gradients saved, such as this one, this one, this one. And of course, I can change that in the future. And in order to create my angular gradient blur, I'm going to go to Effects, and I'm going to change this to Layer Blur. And I'm going to set this to about 20, or whatever strength of the blur. And when you do that, you can see that the colors of your glow has multiple tones, and that's what makes it so interesting. And when you apply that to your button, look at that. It's gorgeous. And you're going to see a lot more designers using this. This is a fairly new technique in the design world, but from a technical perspective, this is easily done in CSS and SwiftUI. So I'm not worried about the technical side. And I'm a designer who's really passionate about design and code. So when I design something, I want to make sure that my engineers are able to replicate that easily, and that's exactly what's happening here. So this is a technique I wanted to show you. It's not that complicated. Another details that I like to show you is that you can also use more blending mode to make your colors more interesting. So most designers, they're going to use a stroke that is white and with a certain level of opacity. One thing that you can do, and this is freely available in CSS and SwiftUI, so you don't have to think too much about the technical side. You're going to use the blending mode, soft light, or overlay. So if you want more colors, you can use overlay. If you want less vibrancy, you can use soft light. So those are two that I use. Color dodge is too hard. If you use color dodge, you have to make sure that your whiteness is less than 100%. Otherwise, it's just going to be white. So it's too much. And you can also, if you're using color dodge, it's also going to play with the color of your outline as well. So you can see here, depending on the color of my outline, the darkness of my outline, it's going to change the colors and the vibrancy. But it's a lot harder to control, which is why I like to use overlay if I want more vibrancy, or soft light like this one. So it creates a very nice tone of colors. So let me show you what I'm doing and what I've been experimenting a lot with this technique. And I find this to be so interesting. So let me give you an example. We have two blur layers here. So we have the first one, which fades out nicely to the background. The background also fading out. Typically, if you don't do the fade out, it's gonna be a single solid color. Okay, and it's gonna look like this. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that what I wanted to go with is something that you can easily fade into the content, and you're gonna see a lot more of that in the future. Especially I see that in Big Sur. If you go to the widgets on the right side and you start scrolling, you're gonna see this beautiful, masking with linear opacity. And it's beautiful. So that's exactly what I'm trying to do here, is to set a linear gradient so that the background of my blur fades nicely to my second blur. And I think that's a really cool technique. Another thing that I want to show you also is that we can use that gradient technique. Sorry, it's a little bit slow. So let me just so you can see that this very light glow here, and all right, so I have my modal, I have my, let me go to my buttons. Okay, so this is my button, and this is my glow. So the glow, as I mentioned before, is simply the shape of my button, and I'm using a layer blur. So if I'm not using the layer blur, it's gonna look like this. So let me just disable it. There you go. So this is what it looks like. What I wanted to try is that instead of setting a layer blur on the entirety of the button, I'm only going to set the gradient on the outline. So this is something I wanted to try, and this is feasible in CSS and SwiftUI as well. So we have the stroke, and the stroke, let me just make sure that I'm selecting the right thing. Ghost button, okay, there you go. So I have my stroke, and the stroke is using an angular gradient instead of using it on a background. And so as a result, I'm setting it to 5, but I can also set it to 10. I can set it to 1, right? So I'm setting it to 5, and I have my multiple colors, but at the bottom, I wanted it to fade nicely. So the same technique as gradual, gradual masking. I'm setting the colors to be completely transparent at the bottom. And so when I do that, I have this beautiful angular gradient on the outline. And because it's on the outline, you know, I can essentially use layer blur, and boom, I have this glow here that is kind of like space-ish. That's kind of like where I want to take the theme, is something that looks a little bit spacey, like looking at the sky, night sky. And depending on the amount of blur, for example, if I can set it to 10, look at that, look at how beautiful that is. It's so, so nice, depending on the strength. And you can certainly animate that as well, because all of these values that I'm playing with right now is all animatable in CSS and in SwiftUI. So I can totally animate the blur strength on an outline using an angular blur. It's not impossible. Talk to any developer, they're gonna say, of course, you can do that. So that's exactly what I want to show you. I love to explore these techniques to create these beautiful things that, you know, I've never seen before, or I've been inspired elsewhere, and I wanted to take it to the next level. As you can see, depending on the strength and the opacity, look at that. You know, it's so interesting when you have a button that looks like this. And this is fairly normal. You can set a gradient on the text. So I've seen Apple does that a lot on their website. I love when they do this. And let me just fix the camera for a second. Okay, there you go. We're back. And yeah, you know, at the end of the day, you want to make your design interesting, right? Most people will go with simply a flat color. And there's nothing wrong with that, you know? It's nothing wrong with having a flat color and just make it white. But what if you want to, you know, take it to the next level? You want to use, you know, a gradient color to make it even more interesting without stealing attention too much necessarily. And there you go. You have this beautiful gradient on the text. And I'm also using this, this blur on the outline here. So if I set the blur, so you can see the same technique, I'm using that angular gradient on the outline. And that's what creates this beautiful effect. This is why I love my job, by the way. I just get to, you know, explore these techniques every single day, and both in design and code, of course. And another thing that you can do with this is you can also use overlay, so that, you know, with vibrancy in iOS, you know, in iOS you can set the vibrancy of the text, and it's going to take the colors of the background. So when you have a shape like this in the background, then you can set the vibrancy. Another thing that I realized that you can do in Figma is that you can set a layer with both layer blur and background blur. So let me just give you an example and why this is so cool. This is an inexpensive technique, and I love inexpensive techniques, because when you have inexpensive techniques, then your developers can easily implement it without, you know, having to make it wait and put it in the freezer. Let me just fix the camera again. All right, so again, this is not feasible in Chrome, by the way. I tested it in Safari. This works beautiful in Safari. Let me show you an example of what I mean by that. Okay. Okay, my system is getting really slow, so it's going to be very hard. I think the more that I'm streaming, the longer that I stream, the more the system goes slow. So I'm going to have to deal with that in the future. But for now, let me see. I wanted to show you, yes, it's this blur layer here is both a background blur and also a layer blur. So As a result, when you change, it blurs the element and it fits nicely into the background. So to do that in Figma, it's the same. So layer blur plus background blur. And when I move it around, you can see that it blurs the element and it fits nicely into the background. Okay? If I don't set, let's say, my layer blur, it's gonna look like this. This is my background blur layer. If I only set the layer blur without the background blur, well, there's nothing, right? Because my background here is 1% and it's completely transparent. So if I set the background blur, this is where it blurs the background, but also it blurs itself. So it's a very cool technique that I picked up. And again, it's feasible in CSS for Safari, but not yet available in Chrome. I haven't tested it in SwiftUI, but I think that could be an interesting thing to do. So I think that's basically it for today. I'm gonna take some questions, and then we can end this live stream right here. Of course, I can go deeper into the design system. We already covered in the last live stream about annotations and making sure that you're setting the comments. You also want to make sure that you're reusing the same components even though it's smaller. So for example, this smaller component, using the technique that I just showed you, is the same component whether it's the bigger version or the smaller version. And I think that's a really cool way to go about it. So annotations, setting your components in place so that you can easily switch. In another live stream, we're gonna get into variants and interactive components, but I haven't played enough with those things. I do find that this is enough for me. And I guess if you look at some of these design system here, it's important to set your auto layout properly. And you can see this is auto layout inside another auto layout. So when I add another piece of text, it's going to increase both the container and also the content container. And that's exactly what I want to do. The same with these avatars and logo. If I want to add more logos or more avatars, it's going to increase the size of my container. So yeah, use auto layout everywhere. It's so good. And it's going to save so much time. It's going to add a lot of consistency to your design. So let me take the questions. By the way, if you enjoy this live stream, please give a thumbs up. Really appreciate it. What do you think about Flutter for web? Could it be a great alternative to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? I think Flutter for web is exciting. I haven't yet heard a lot of feedback about it yet. So that kind of tells me that the adoption is still not there. But I do know that Flutter for mobile is really hot. And it's only a matter of time before it's going to get into the web. The same for SwiftUI, right? Like SwiftUI first started for iOS, and then eventually now it's all available across all of the platforms for Apple. And I wouldn't be surprised that in the future, we might be able to use SwiftUI for web as well. Again, this is pure speculation, but that's how I see the future. I think CSS is interesting, but at the same time, we cannot disregard the way that we are designing in all of these other platforms. And I find that SwiftUI is easily, to me, the best way to implement your design. It has so many options, and Apple provides so much in terms of layout, components, and also adaptivity across multiple platforms with a very minimal amount of code. But as of now, I haven't really explored much. I haven't receive a lot of feedback about Flutter for web, but feel free in the comments, anyone who has used Flutter for web, to give your feedback. Can you do more content about coding? Yes, absolutely. Right now we're redesigning the iOS app, and I want to make sure that everything is really like well done. We have all of these components, design system, and because we're implementing it, and you want to make sure that your developers are on board. They know exactly how it works. They know exactly how it adapts. And when you have like a really good setup like this, which again I'm going to be sharing the source files to my subscribers, and you're going to be able to play with all of this stuff. And you'll see it's just so easy to design new screens and to explain to your developers how it's supposed to look like, depending on how much text that you have, whether it's one line or 2 lines. And when I change that, it automatically adapts the size of my screen, the size of my container, and that's exactly what I want to do and what I want to show my developers when they're going to be implementing this, if it's not me, right? Like oftentimes it's me, but oftentimes it's also developers who are going to be working on your designs. And when they see a well thought out design like that, a design system in place, they're going to be really enjoying working with you. So and as a designer, you have a lot more flexibility as well. So if I want to change easily some of these blobs, I can quickly switch that. Make sure that you know exactly how to play with the constraints. So for example, here I want to make sure that the elements inside my component is going to scale, because these are blobs, and blobs are supposed to be scaling. If I don't, so that when I resize the blobs, it's going to resize. If I resize the container, it's going to resize the blob as well. And I need to resize the blobs because I have multiple sizes of the same component. So you see this component right here of these blobs is the same component that I'm using in a smaller version, which is right here. And because these are 2 of the same, I want to make sure that I can resize my artwork, and it's going to fit nicely in these 2 instances. And you have to master the idea of constraints, whether you're using scale, whether you're you're setting the magnets to the top, left, bottom, or right, or both, and you want to center it, or you want your container to follow the size of your screen, as I've shown earlier. Really master the constraints as a result of this, and really master auto layout, fill container, hux content, and of course you can also use the different paddings, as well as you can use the space between feature that I showed you earlier. Yes, so let me see. Will you be sharing the design system? Yes. Yes, I'm streaming in 4K because I really want people to see all the details. And yes, it's taking a lot of computer juice. Honestly, because I'm streaming a lot nowadays, I'm recording a lot. I'm going to be upgrading my system to the M1 or M1X computer very soon. So I'm just waiting for Apple. So which OS is it? This is the Mac OS Big Sur, and I'm designing for iOS. Thank you for the kind comments. Do you freelance? Not at the moment. We are fully, involved in designing and also in teaching designers how to code, but also developers how to design. And I hope these live stream help. And because of our subscribers, we are allowed to do this full time. What does the CSS code look like for the Angular gradient button? I haven't tried it yet, but as I explained earlier, it's a simple, element with Angular gradient. and you blur that layer, and that's it. And it's going to be the same size of your button. I don't believe it's going to be a challenge. I already played a lot. So I'm a Flutter beginner and I learned the basics. I'm learning by doing, watching speed code. Try to understand, is this the way? Good. Yes, absolutely. Practice is going to make you into a good designers or developers, analyzing their files, their source files, looking at the documentation whenever necessary. Don't focus too much on the theory. Don't start reading like, 2-3 books before even starting your own design or starting your own app. Start your app first, and then whenever you need that information, make sure that you're able to go to that book, to go to that documentation, and easily reference those things as you build. I like to do the two at the same time so that I don't forget. If I read a book and I don't practice it, I forget everything. So when I do that at the same time, then it allows me to learn much faster and much more efficiently. Are the blobs saved as PNG, SVG? So the way that I'm using blobs is that they're saved as PNG, as SVG for the web, as PDF for iOS. So PDF is for iOS, and SVG is still limited in terms of support, but I do believe that Apple is probably gonna fully support SVG very soon. As for Flutter and for Android development, you can use SVG as well. So yes, for now we have to use PDF, or you can use PNG. But if you use PNG, make sure that it's double the size so that you don't have these pixelation issues. How do you create that glass morphism background? So I've been covering glass morphism a number of times in my previous live stream. So it's a simple layer with background blur, and I'm also using the outline. So the outline, in this case, it's a linear outline, but you can also use a normal outline with about 10% or 20% opacity. And then I have a second, glass morphic layer. So you can use it in multiple places. I've been using it here and also in these avatars as the halo of my avatar. So do you have any plan to remove the blur effect for accessibility? So accessibility, to me, I don't think it has much to do with the blur effect. I think it has more to do with the readability, the contrast ratio, and all of these things. As long as you don't break those rules for accessibility, then it doesn't matter if you're using a drop shadow or a blur effect or a background blur. In fact, you can see black background blur pretty much everywhere in iOS, and I don't think they have any problems with accessibility. So as long as your text is set to a dynamic type, such as I have here in my design system. Let me just show you. So this is my dynamic type, and this is respecting the dynamic type of iOS. So a large title is 34. As I mentioned in the previous live streams, we have the iOS human interface guidelines, and you want to make sure that you're also following the same names for the dynamic types, such as title, title 1, title 2, title 3, headline, body, callout. I want to be consistent in code because, at the end of the day, my developer is going to come here and say, okay, well, I'm going to use large title. I'm going to use title 3. And if it's a custom text style, then I'm telling them that, okay, this is a medium font weight, and this is a semi-bold, and this is using uppercase. So when I do this, and by understanding the implementation of it, it saves so much time, and it also helps a lot with the communication between designers and developers. So let's see if we have any last question. Do you have a course for designers who want to code? Yes, all my courses are about designers who want to code. Every single technique, such as what I'm showing in this live stream, is all taking the coding aspect into consideration. How can I make that amazing background? So the background, that's a good question. So I love to play with backgrounds, and to me, backgrounds at the very start is a gradient. Okay, so if you look at this background here, at the very start is just a gradient, right? Where you can sort of like make things more interesting is you can draw these wave shapes, and there's a number of plugins in Figma where you can draw these shapes, such as the wave. So let me just show you. I'm going to go to the community. I'm going to go to the plugins, and let's say you want to search for wave. So there's a bunch of plugins that allow you to create these waves, and there's also another one that I love called Looper, which allows you to duplicate multiple times the same shape or outline. There's also another one called Blob, which creates these blobs that you see in my designs, and and match that with gradients and blur and layer blur and background blur. Then you are going to end up with a design that looks like this. Of course, it takes a lot of practice and to create a composition that makes sense, but eventually, you can have these outlines, you can have these dots, which creates the stars, you can have these blobs here that is using layer blur, right, with angular gradient, and all of these things together creates a beautiful background for your design. And it's a lot of practice. I know I'm simplifying it a lot. It takes a lot of practice to put everything together to make it make sense, but eventually you're going to get there. You have so many tools, so many options in place, such as like, let's say this outline here, I'm using the advanced option for the advanced stroke, and I'm using the dash. So for example, if I set to 5, it's going to create these dotted lines, but I can also set it to 200, 100, and it creates a more falling star kind of concept. That's kind of what I was going for, is you create a line, and then you set the outline, you use advanced stroke, and you use the dash, the size of the dash and the spacing between the dash, and you create this kind of falling star pattern. And I was going for a night sky concept, and this is what we have so far. The illustrations are made by Aksanvari, who is in our team. So we have a team of designers who are focused on creating these illustrations, but also these presentations, and also putting the colors together. Some of these I made it myself, and some of these are made by my team. So we try to be consistent across the board, and we try to be improving over time. But definitely, Axon is really a league on her own in terms of the way she's able to create some of these illustrations, such as the face here, and let me see. Super slow, but so let me just remove this and the content, and also this other blur layer. There you go. So you see that this is a face, and in the background you have the stars, you have the planets, and then you have these outlines. So it definitely takes a lot more practice to get to this, but you have to start somewhere, right? Everyone starts somewhere. It's not like we all just came in and become experts overnight. It's just a lot of practice. And again, we share all the resources. We have illustrations that we that we sell, and in a beautiful package with icons. It's called shape.so, and all the illustrations that we use in my designs are taken from shape.so. So you go to icons and you go to illustrations, and you have all of these beautiful illustrations. We have about 2041, and all of this in a very affordable package of, I believe it's like $70 if I remember correctly. But you can change the colors. So we have some of these preset colors, and you can download it in multiple formats such as SVG and PDF. And once you have that illustration, then you can start coloring yourself using gradients and colors, and again using those resources about gradients and colors, and you're gonna end up with a more, you know, a different style, such as this one. We're using gradients, we're using colors, but otherwise you can always use the flat colors that we have in the original package. Awesome. Yes, refactoring the UI is amazing for developers who wants to learn design, but also for designers who wants to learn like a more kind of like you know, sort of like the design system aspect of it, and the consistency and typography and all that stuff. Of course, on DesignCode.io we have courses for developers, for designers, design system in Figma, UI design for developers. We have a Figma handbook which has about 40 tutorials. We have iOS design handbook which has 20 tutorials. We're gonna keep adding a lot more content for design, and I'm gonna keep making these live streams for you so that you can learn with me and explore new techniques with me. So we have a lot of questions. Do I use Visual Studio? Yes, we love Visual Studio. It's amazing. It has amazing extensions. It's, you know, we use both Visual Studio Code for web, and we use Xcode for iOS development. All right, so how much time does it take to finish this project? So that totally depends on your speed. Me, I like to go fast, and I like to go efficiently. I don't like to spend weeks and weeks on a single design. You know, you can talk to anyone in my team, they know how fast I go. But also I like to iterate. I don't like to, you know, to wait a month or two before getting somewhere. I like to start with a simpler design first, depending on the resources that I have at hand, the amount of time that I have at hand. You have to keep in mind that I have to work on courses, I have to create these live streams, I have to, you know, I have to code myself. You know, like if you look at, you know, these websites, you know, like this one, I did most of the challenging styles and animations, and you know, I don't have a choice because we have we have a team of early designers and developers, and when we have early designers and developers, you have to be able to kind of like lead by example. You have to show them, okay, this is how you would do it, and you have to set all of these components in place so that they can use that and they can take it to the next level. And so that's why I have to start all of these designs by myself at first. And when I have these designs ready, that's when I can talk to my other designers and developers. I can tell them, well, you know, you can take it from here, right? And I find that to be an incredibly efficient process without, you know, without asking too much from me and asking too much from them, and to be able to also collaborate between all of our designers and developers. So in terms of specific time, I would say to me, a design like this takes maybe, you know, a couple days to get like the main themes good, and then a couple more days to set the components and the design system and set all of these comments and constraints and auto layout. So keep in mind that in the first couple of days, you're not going to care too much about creating your components and setting your auto layout and setting these annotations and these arrows. You don't need to do that at first. You know, you have to move fast. You have to get to a point of motivation and inspiration. And when you feel comfortable, and when you feel that you're reusing the same elements over and over and over, and that's when you start zipping everything together, creating a design system. And when you feel comfortable, then you start inviting the rest of your team for them to start implementing and also contributing to the design system. So the first 2 days, just go really freely. So for me, the first 2 days is this, right? Like this is me designing in the first 2 days. This, right? There's no real system. It's just exploring different things, different elements. If you look at, none of these layers are components yet, and I don't want it to be, because I want to move it around. I want to, restructure it as I wish. So I don't want to waste time, and I don't want to constrain myself to a set of rules when I can just go, free flowing in my, in my creativity. So this is me in the first couple of days, right? This is me in the first couple of days. I'm just exploring the concepts, the color themes, the design, the approach, the night sky, the dark mode, the light mode, the buttons, and all of these things. And then, after that couple of days, then I'm gonna start sharing with my team, and then I look at how it can be implemented in CSS or in SwiftUI, and I look at the constraints, the limitations, the decisions that I have to make, if it's worth it or not. Because sometimes you want something as a designer, but then you realize your developer is gonna take 2 weeks to make it, and you're like, is it really worth it? Right? Is it really worth having like a custom tab bar, and take 2 weeks additionally to ship your product? Or you can use the tab bar that is by default in iOS, and this takes, maybe an hour to set up, or less. It's just a few lines of code, but of course you have to set SF symbols and all that stuff. So those are the decisions that you have to make. And the more you know about development, the more you communicate with your developers, the better you can make these decisions so that you can ship your app faster. And we love efficiency. So yes, the app is going to be real. We're already in the beta, so the beta is in the description at the bottom. And right now we're still in the process of redesigning some of the new changes. Currently, the beta, you're going to be able to see this design right here. So it's a lot more basic, and that's because I didn't have a lot of time to spend on design. So I wanted to start with something fairly basic, but on a second iteration, and especially for dark mode, this is what we have, and we're trying to go much further, and that's what you see here. And now we're in the process of redesigning a lot of these components without necessarily changing the whole structure. So if you notice that this design here is not a complete redesign of this one, right? It's not a complete redesign, and that's on purpose, because I don't want my developers to completely change their entire SwiftUI code. I only want them to elevate their, some of their components, like the play button, instead of looking like this, it's going to look like this one, right? And it's, we're adding some elements such as the angular blur, we're adding some different colors, and we're adding a little bit of glass morphism, but that's it. There's nothing much more than that. And here, we're adding a little bit of a glass layer here, but otherwise, it's essentially the same as here, right? So we're only elevating the details rather than, completely changing the design, and at the cost of maybe 2 or 3 more weeks. So that's it for this live stream. Again, thank you so much for coming to this live stream. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoy this. We're going to do one next week, and next week is going to be about SwiftUI. So I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.